Thank you for joining us tonight for one of those book launches that happen mid-month on the third Thursday of the month when a wonderful new author shows up with a wonderful new book like we have this evening. I'm so delighted to welcome Christine Silk this evening. And welcome all of you. For those of you who have never attended a book club before, our book club has been happening since 2011. We started by reading the books that Charles Birchfield read, but pivoted to reading the books written by artists from our own region, which is in full alignment with our mission to support the incredible talents all around us, our neighbors, our friends, and those in our community. My name is Mary Kozub. I'm the Director of Education here, and I'm with my colleague, Michaela Waros, who is taking care of all the tech. It will be recorded this evening. And I think I'm done talking because I'm turning everything over to another colleague and a dear friend, Kelly Murphy, who is going to introduce her sister, Christine Silk, to us. So thank you all for coming and welcome, Christine.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out to support Christine. I'm actually here more to facilitate questions. I think we've had a couple discussions. If people have questions as we go along, great. If not, we'll definitely allow time at the end for any questions. The book that we're talking about this evening, The Dark Fire, I was given an advance copy, but there are copies available. Christine also brought her other book of short stories, Chasing the Sun, which is on the table as well. We'll have her also talk about that. And thank you so much. It's so great to see everybody here tonight.
So I just want to say a few words. First, I want to thank you for making this possible. Mary, I want to thank you for all you've done to make this event happen. And Michaela, thank you so much for your technical expertise in getting everything set up. And this is a lovely space. I haven't been here to the Birchfield since 30 or 40 years ago. That tells you how long it's been. It's absolutely gorgeous here. And I'm so honored and happy to be here. And I want to thank all of you for being here as well. I will be signing books for whoever wants me to, and I will stay as late as I need to. So just so you know that after we're done talking and having this conversation, happy to sign books. So take it away.
Yeah, so I was so proud of you for this book. It was not what I expected. When I read the foreword and reading the back, there was so much more to it than I actually expected. So do you want to tell people a little bit about the story and
Yeah. So before I talk about the book, my mom, Dee Murphy, wanted me to talk a little bit about my background.
Oh, yeah.
So is it okay if I just give like 1 or 2 minute summary of my background and how I became an author? So I started writing from a pretty early age. Even before I could actually write words, I would make picture books and staple the pages together. Mom remembers that. Mom taught me to read. I knew how to read by the time I started school because Mom used to teach me with flashcards and the phonics method. Thank you, Mom. It paid off. I worked on school newspapers starting at least in middle school, junior high, high school, college. I was an English major as an undergrad. I went to graduate school. I got my PhD at Carnegie Mellon University in the English department. And my dissertation was how stories persuade people. So I looked at throughout history, how do stories actually change our minds about things? I was a full-time mom for over 25 years. And when my children all left the nest, which was just about 2 or 3 years ago, I decided to actually launch my novel. This novel is the one that I decided would be first. I've completed 2 other novels and I've started at least 3 others. And I launched this, just within the last few weeks. And my book of short stories, which is also available tonight, I launched that about 8 years ago. And short stories are a lot easier to deal with than a novel, because with a short story, it's short, right? So you can see exactly what's going on. Like you can hold the whole picture in your head. With a novel, it's a lot harder, and it's really easy to lose track of what's going on if you're not paying attention. Like if you make a change in chapter 4, it could reverberate and be a problem in chapter 32 if you're not paying attention. So you really have to be on top of it. And yeah, and so that's my background. And I love stories and I love writing. And I think a lot about how stories are put together and how they work. And just as an overall thing, stories are so important to us as human beings because it's how we really interact with the world. We live in time and space. We think about our lives. We experience our life through time and space. And this is how we relate to each other. We tell each other stories about what we've done, where we've been. We share stories like, you and I share an upbringing, a common past. Like we have these memories, and the memories are told as stories. And everything in our life that entertains us is pretty much a story, from video games to movies to television series. It's all story, and it's all so important. And so my aim as a storyteller is to tell the best story that I can, to make my characters as real to you, the reader, as I can possibly make them, and to make the story meaningful so that you take something away from it that gives you an insight into human behavior, into the way that the world works. And that's really what my aim is. And I want it to be so interesting to you. And I hope I've succeeded. I really do. So
Yeah, I think with this book in particular, you did. Mom and I had a couple discussions about, some of the other authors that both of us have read over the years that can't find that balance between telling a good story and over-telling a good story. Being so descriptive that 10 pages in, they're still talking about the same thing. So being able to bring the story to life and to have enough wording to visualize what's going on, and then to have that relationship to the characters, I thought was one of the great things about this novel. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's very hard as a writer to know how much description do you need to give. If any of you have ever read Charles Dickens or some of the other older British writers, they used to spend so much time describing, like, when you walk into this room, there was this happening, and in this room, it's like they're giving you a whole house tour before they actually start the story. And that gets to be a really long, kind of a slog for a modern reader. What I try to do is I try to bring in the detail and make it kind of quick. Bring in the detail just enough to give you context. And if I need to add more description in later, that's what I try to do.
right.
Do I need to describe what this book is about? Should I do that?
I think so. Would everyone like to hear just a little synopsis?
Yes.
I mean, of course,
Yes.
the description on the back is nice, but from your own words, you wrote, I'm sure you wrote this. But
Yeah, I mean, to do back jacket cover copy, you really have to, you got to make it as compelling as you can, but it can't capture everything, obviously, right? This is over 400 pages. It's a big story, and to capture it in this many words on an Amazon description or on the back of a book, I worked on it a lot to try to really get the essence and try to get people to say, oh, I'd really like to know more. I got the inspiration for this story by reading Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, that's a very old story. It goes back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And when I read Dracula, I was really compelled with the drama of it, because Bram Stoker was also a playwright and a dramatist, and he did have an eye for drama. What I was thinking to myself is, if I ever tell the Dracula story, I would really love to focus on the escape. In his story, he kind of glosses over Jonathan Harker's escape from the Baron's castle. And I thought, if I ever write this story, I would really like to spend more time on how did Jonathan actually escape? And that's why I did name my main character Jonathan. It's sort of like a hat tip to Bram Stoker. But I didn't want to just copy everything. I wanted to kind of make that whole vampire legend my own, and kind of transform it a little bit. Like, what does a vampire mean in modern times? And in my introduction, if you've read it, vampires to me are people who operate off of a place of coercion and force and try to bend other people to their will. The vampire character has always been a charismatic figure, someone who's absolutely fascinating in a supernatural way of being able to, there's almost a sense of casting a spell on people, but there's also the sense of, that the vampire bite turns the victim onto the vampire's side. And that's a very, very interesting metaphor for, I think, the way that a lot of very charismatic people operate in the world. It's like they bite you with their charm, and then you're on their side. Now, the other big influence on this novel is something called the Golem legend, which is from Jewish lore. And the golem was a creature that was created by a rabbi in Prague, which is in the Czech Republic, in the 1500s to protect the Jews of Prague from threats of a pogrom. A pogrom is like a massacre that would happen, that the Jews were under direct threat. And so this supernatural creature was created out of the mud by a rabbi. Now, the important thing to understand about the Jewish view of supernatural manipulations like that is that Judaism does not, how do I want to put this? Judaism sees supernatural manipulation or supernatural creation of a golem as ultimately coming from God. It's not about man's ability to do things or human ability to channel supernatural forces. It's about God working through humans who prepare themselves for the awesome responsibility of creating something like a golem out of the mud, who can then go and protect the Jews of Prague. And so what I did in this book is I kind of combined then the Dracula legend with the golem legend. And I tried to make my characters as real and as visual for you, the reader, as I possibly could.
Yeah, taking that supernatural, that fantasy, and making it seem like it's a story that could be actualized, right? Like it's
Yeah.
you're not in a suspended disbelief. You're actually believing that this story had or did occur. Or could occur, I guess, is how I felt while I was reading it.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to point out that a good writer of supernatural, or pretty much any genre, but let's just take supernatural, needs to make the rules very clear. Like, there are always rules of supernatural ability, whether we're talking about like Harry Potter magicians or like witches who can do certain things. The rules of the supernatural world have to be made clear to the reader so the reader knows what the limitations are. Because if your powers are infinite, then your bad guys can get killed off on page 2 and then you don't have a story anymore, right? So those rules always have to be made clear. And that's why I really tried to stay like historically true to what I thought the golem legend really was and what a golem can and cannot do.
So I like this question about being able to write that character that is evil or diabolical. I mean, was that challenging for you? I mean, I'm sure you consider yourself a good person and, having to convey a character that, like you said, you want that character, you see that Baron or that vampire as charming people, but the essence of who they are is really evil. So, like, tell me about the process. And
so as a writer, I try to just present my characters as they're acting in that scene. And I try not to preach or moralize. I try to let you, the reader, decide, do you really think that this is an evil character? Like, the character is doing X, Y, and Z. What do you, the reader, really think about that? like, I try not to insert too much of myself as the writer. I just try to be honest. And I try to really show the motivations of the character, whether I personally consider them good or bad, in a way doesn't matter. I want their motivations to just be discernible. And if their motivations are not discernible, that could be interesting too, because you're wondering, why are they doing this? It seems to go against who they are. And then my job as a writer is at some point for that to be clear to you, like maybe 2 chapters on, you see, oh, that's why they did it. It's kind of like if you're a psychiatrist and you're taking care of patients who've done really terrible things, you have to suspend your judgment on them. Otherwise, you're not going to make any progress in the therapy, right? You have to just kind of take what they're telling you and try to work within their logic and their value system. And you can still make value judgments to yourself, but if you're going to make progress with your client, you really need to just let them talk and get into their logic. And that's really what I try to do with each of my characters, is figure out what's that character's internal logic. How do they see the world? And then just try to make it consistent. If I'm describing something from their point of view or showing them taking an action, it should be pretty clear that, yes, this is consistent with who they are. And if it's not, again, that should be explained at some point. If it seems like it's an inconsistency or something's weird or kind of off, that should be like, that mystery should be cleared up at some point in the book. So did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then that makes me question, like, are you making it up as you go along? Are you already knowing how you want it to end, or how you want it to develop, or how that story is going to be told, and what those circumstances are to allow those characters to justify themselves, or to describe themselves in situations? So I guess there's a couple of questions.
There are a couple of questions. Let me see if I can unpack it. Speaking personally, and I think other fiction writers feel this way, I get surprised by my own characters. I do not plot out every single thing that they do. I sit down to write and I throw a lot of stuff out. I mean, I rewrote the first 1/3 of this book because I just didn't think it was good enough. And it took me a long time to rewrite 1/3 of a 400-page novel. I think that the writing process is always a process of discovery for every writer. Even if you're writing nonfiction, there's this old saying, how can I know what I think unless I can see what I say? I feel that way as a writer. And what I mean by see what I say is I need to actually write out the paragraph or 2 paragraphs so that I can see what I think. Because when you're doing the writing, it's like a feedback both ways between how you think and what your argument is and what your story is. And I don't know how to describe it except to say that my characters really do surprise me. It took me a long time to get a handle on Jonathan, my main character, and I'm not really quite sure why. Some of my characters, I felt like I knew them right from the get-go, like Agatha, she's one of the servants, and like Joe, who is the golem. I felt like I had a good handle on him right away, but Jonathan, I had to really work at. And Jonathan's wife, Anne, I had to really work on her too, because I started out not really liking her, but I had to find her good points and really find her motivation and really learn to be more sympathetic towards her. And my main protagonist, the Baron, even though I disagree with him, he does have a logic, and I can understand him. And I get why he does what he does. And I think that's really important for a writer, to be open to all of their characters and just let those motivations come in. You're not the character, but in a certain sense you are, because it's coming from you. It's a very strange thing. There's one more point that I want to say, and that is, this is going to sound really woo-woo, and you're probably not going to be surprised that it sounds that way, given that I've written a supernatural novel. But I do really feel that stories pick the writer. The writer doesn't necessarily pick the story. It's almost like the writer is a medium who they channel the story from, I don't want to say another world, but it kind of is. If you believe that the subconscious or the unconscious is another world, then you kind of are channeling it. Or if it is literally coming from a world that's not our own physical world, there is a channeling, like a medium, like a psychic medium that comes down. I really feel that that is a real phenomenon. Not all writers feel that way. There are some writers who are very rational, very not religious, and they would disagree with me, but that's just been my experience with it.
Well, so you were influenced by Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the story you felt like was just something that came to like.
Well, it had to be,
like,
right?
what was the first one? Were you thinking of this story and then you reached out and embraced the Dracula story? I mean, like, which one was first? Like this?
Well, I would have to say first, when I read Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is before I read The Golem of Prague. The Golem of Prague was the main book that I modeled my Golem after, but I did a lot of things differently than The Golem of Prague, which was written by Gershon Winkler about 50 years ago. I did a lot of things differently. I think good writers can do that, right? Like, because on one level, there's really no such thing as a new story. Like a romance is always kind of a takeoff on a Romeo and Juliet theme, let's just say. Like, there's a lot of Romeo and Juliet variations, right? So what a good writer does is they kind of take it and they make it their own. So what does make it their own mean? Well, you don't know what that's going to really look like until you actually sit down and write it. And not only until you sit down and write it, but sometimes you just got to put it aside and then go back and read it. And some of it you're going to think this is really great, and others you're going to think I got to change this. So again, it's that mysterious process because you don't know what you're really going to come up with. And sometimes even when you're coming up with it, you don't know what you've come up with until you come back and take a look and you're like, oh, that's what I need to do in the next chapter is I need to take this thing that I've already written and expand upon it. I have to tell you, it's a really trippy thing.
Yeah.
And I don't even do drugs and it's a trippy thing. So, and other writers have that there are writers in history who, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I guess he did laudanum or whatever, which is opium and alcohol. I mean, writers do have an affinity for mind altering substances. It's just not my thing. It's fine. But you don't need drugs to get into that kind of trippy mindset where you're kind of in a trance and you're just seeing what needs to be done next. Or maybe you're not seeing it so well, but you just work anyway. And you just find it. You just find the vibe. And it takes a long time. It does take a long time, at least for me. I'm a slow writer. So I want to get back to one other thing you'd asked. We writers don't know how it's going to end. At least I don't. I didn't know how this book was going to end. And I'm not going to say what the ending is because it would be a spoiler. Mm-hmm. But we don't always know what's going to happen in the next scene. And there were scenes that I wrote that I ended up taking out because I thought they didn't add anything. And that's where the judgment in the editing part comes in. Once you've got the novel completed, you go back and you think, do I really need this? Do I really need that? Because you end up writing more than you really need. At least I do. And that's a good problem to have because I think it's easier to take away than to add. It's easier just to kind of pare it down.
Well, you hear about writer's block, people who are trying to write that have writer's block. So I guess it is great that your juices are flowing and you have all this coming out. So the process the time frame for writing it and how long was that editing?
Well, okay. I started this book well over 10 years ago, And my kids were still all living at home at the time. Now they're on their own. They've left the nest. And what I would do with this book is I would bring my laptop with me to the dentist's office when they were getting their braces adjusted or to the doctor's office or whatever. And I would write a paragraph or two, or if they're in music lesson and I have to wait an hour because, it's a music lesson for two of the kids, I would just be sitting there working on the novel. There's a lot of repetition because I didn't have time to go back and read like the previous 10 pages, I would just pick up where I left off. So there was a ton of repetition. I hired a developmental editor in 2022 who came highly recommended. She's one of the best editors I've ever worked with. I talk about her, I mentioned her in the acknowledgements. And she went through it with a fine-tooth comb. And she's just really a great editor. And she said, the first 1/3 of your book is just too much like Bram Stoker's Dracula. You really, really need to do something like more original. I thought, at first I'm thinking, well, like, I don't know. I kind of like the way it is. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought she's really right. I really do need to really make it my own. And that's when I did the rewrite of the first 1/3. And that took like a good 12 to 18 months. Because like I said, I'm a really slow writer. And even though my kids were out of the house by then, it's hard to face a blank page. Like if you're just going to decide, okay, the first 1/3 needs to be rewritten. I work on a computer screen. It's like, you just got a blank page. It's like, what in the world am I going to write? Like, this is so daunting. Like, I know what writer's block feels like. And there would be days where I'd be like, I just can't work on this. I got to work on something else.
If I remember correctly, the 1/3 of it was really the escape part for Jonathan. So was the original still the escape? Were you still focused on that telling?
Yeah, like that wasn't really like the escape that you read in this book now is still the escape that I had in my original draft. Mainly what it was the setup of him being in the Barons territory, which is in Eastern Europe in the Carpathian Mountains. She felt that it mirrored too much what Bram Stoker had already done. And at first, like I said, I didn't quite agree with her, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, this is an opportunity for me to really use my imagination and not just do another derivative Dracula story. How about if I really make it my own? Because, the whole vampire genre has spun off some really great stuff. Like you think about Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. I don't know how many of you have read it. I've read it. I think it's really good. There's the Twilight series, which I have not read. But I mean, there's so much to do. There's just a whole rich history, movies, books, comic books, video games, like so much of it just gets spun off into these other genres, which is great because there is something really rich there that I think really speaks to us as people about what is a vampire, what does it mean? And so what I'm doing in this book is really, making my own transformation of that.
And being serendipitous, isn't it kind of great that we're talking about vampires and it's October, just a few days before Halloween? That is perfect. We didn't even know this, what was it, over a year ago when we booked this. I didn't even know what the novel was about. So, as I was reading it, I'm like, oh, it's October. This is so perfect for your novel. So
yeah, and I want to say that as an American, one of the challenges about writing about Great Britain, which is where most of this takes place, was dealing with the class system in Great Britain. A British friend of mine, we did a tour of England. Well, you and I did a tour in 1989. And then we did another tour with our homeschool group when our kids were younger, like in 2015, 2016. I don't remember the year. And I remember like talking to a British friend of mine about some of the ideas for this book. And he said, the thing you've got to understand is that the class system in Great Britain is a very serious institution and it's very rigid. Americans don't really understand it. And it's true. I had to really put my British mindset on when I was writing about this, down to the point where I consulted Debrett's, which is this very old, it's a reference book for how you address people who have different titles of nobility. And I got a copy from 1902, I think. And then I cross-referenced it with one from 1920 so that I knew that the time frame, my novel takes place in 1908, 1909. I want to make sure that I was getting the titles correct, the forms of address. And it is so complicated. And so as an American, I was kind of going crazy, like, it's such a rigid class system, but that's just the way it was. So that was a learning experience. But I tried to really make the historical details as accurate as I possibly could. Like I spent a lot of time researching really minute stuff because if I'm going to, what?
The luggage.
The luggage.
Perfect,
Yeah.
correct name for, I can't remember the piece.
Well, it was a Louis Vuitton portmanteau and a Gladstone bag. A Gladstone bag is like what we think of as like a doctor's medicine bag. That's a real thing. A Gladstone bag was a real thing that existed when this was written. Louis Vuitton, we know he's a, a designer luggage person now. Existed back then. I think Louis Vuitton goes back to the middle 1800s. I don't remember. All I remember is that would have been high-end luggage that someone like my main character would have owned a piece of luggage like that. So
Yeah.
And that's why I put a glossary in the back of this book, because I did use a lot of specialized terms that we moderns might not know. And yeah, you can look it up on your phone, but I wanted to try to make it easier, because if you're on an airplane and you don't have cell service, you can't look up some word that I'm using, but you can go back in the glossary and just see what that means. And so I thought that was an important addition to put in the book.
Well, Mom told me about the glossary. I had my phone next to me a couple of times. I'm like, what is the word?
Portmanteau?
No, the pogrom, the
Massacre
the
thing?
Jewish, the
The
Jewish
pogrom?
pogrom.
Yeah.
So even something like that. And then when I was talking to her last week, she's like, oh, there's a glossary. I'm like, oh gosh, okay. So that was helpful, very helpful. So you mentioned about not liking Anne and then coming around or refining her character. I found her to be quite independent for that time period.
Right.
Which I respected that you took
Right.
the liberties to do that for her. Because I think any of us that think of women of that, still considered Victorian age.
It would be Edwardian by that time. So
Edwardian.
right on the heels, because
Yeah.
yeah.
So, still not, refusing the money from the in-laws. So did she become your favorite character, or is there a character that maybe didn't start off being, you said you didn't like her that much, but then you came
Yeah.
around to her. Is there one or two other characters that you can think of that either you liked all the way through or maybe surprised you in feeling one way or another?
Well, I love Agatha MacLeod, who is the servant who's hired to, like later in the book. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. I love Agatha. She's a plain looking woman, sturdily built, Scottish Catholic, who just has got a lot of courage and a lot of common sense. And I just love her. And my developmental editor loved her to the point that my developmental editor put all in caps, Agatha MacLeod for president. That's what she wrote in the document that she sent me. She's like, I just love this character. And I do too. I love her too. So I would have to say she's my number one favorite. And it's so funny because you would think that your main characters are your favorite ones, but not necessarily. Like, you don't have to love your main characters. You can respect them, like them, try to do right by them as a writer, but you don't have to be like thinking this is the person that I'd really want to be, in a trench with. I would be in a trench with Agatha because she's got so much courage. Yeah.
But your Jonathan character also, if anyone has read Bram Stoker's, your Jonathan character has more, I don't know if vivaciousness is the right word, but he seems stronger than what I remember the Bram Stoker Jonathan character to be as well.
Right. And that could be that we moderns are very much used to our characters in novels as having a lot of psychological sophistication. So back when Bram Stoker was writing, Sigmund Freud was still pretty new on the scene, and the whole vocabulary for psychology and psychological insights was still in its infancy. Now we just use these terms like they're nothing, right? Like enabling, dysfunctional, narcissistic. I mean, this is just common parlance because we're so used to thinking in terms of psychological depth. And I mean, that's how I try to write, is because I love the deep psychology that you can get with a novel. That's one of the great things about a novel, as opposed to, say, a movie doesn't give you quite that interior glimpse into the way someone's thinking. do we want to open up questions to the audience?
Yeah, because I'm trying to think of something else. Anyone have any questions or comments? Did anyone else read it?
I don't know, this is not important.
Yes, I know. I know, because thankfully we were able to,
I haven't finished it. I'm a little more than halfway,
yeah.
but I haven't finished it.
Yeah,
Question about the way you write, not the book itself. May I ask a question about that?
Yes, of course.
Okay. When you started writing, did you feel that you had what you had in you was only a short story because you weren't sure how you could flesh out people or where you were going? So you stayed with short stories, but you knew you had a novel in you? Is this sort of the way you approach?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I've always loved short stories. The first short story writer that really made me excited about the genre was Ray Bradbury. I love Ray Bradbury. I love his short stories. For those of you who don't know his work, he was not just a science fiction writer. He also did non-science fiction stuff, and I just loved him. So I've always loved the short story. And one of the reasons I started with my book of short stories is because it was way easier to do a short story while being a full-time mom than to do a novel. So when my kids left home, that's when I realized I've got now these chunks of time and I've got the headspace, the bandwidth to really work on a novel, like from start to finish. And a lot of this had been done by the time they all left the house. Like it was really pretty much finished by the time my last child went out on her own. But I knew that when you have a draft, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Like I said before, you've got to prune out all of the extra flabby parts, and you've got to bring forward the stuff that really needs more highlighting. So I did feel like I had a novel in me. And like I said, I've completed 2 other novels. They're not in publishable form. And I've started some more that I really am eager to finish because I feel like I've left my characters in the lurch. My characters get to be real people for me. And I feel like I got to complete their story. I kind of owe it to them. Although, I mean, let's face it, every writer abandons some story because they can't figure out what to do. So sometimes the characters never get born. That's kind of how I think of completing the story and publishing it, is they get born. They're born into the world and other people can get to know them. So
I have a question about like your thought process and the writing process. I guess I'm thinking back to, being in school, getting an assignment to write something, and you kind of plot out this like beginning, middle, and end, and then you just have to fill it all in. So do you have that in mind when you got this inspiration for this story, or do you only get, like think of, oh, I want to write about this type of a character or this period of time, or something like that, and then you're developing it as you go? Or do you like maybe have an end thought in mind and then you're working your way backward to figure out how you got to that ending? Do you know what I mean? Like how, like
it's all of that.
Oh, it is.
It can be all of that. And so different writers have different methods. I'll just describe mine. Mostly I'm by the seat of the pants, which means that I don't really outline in any detail. Some writers will outline in detail, like they'll have a whole wall, everything's diagrammed, every chapter, and then every scene in the chapter, and it's got to lead to here. Now, I think that's actually an important technique if you're doing an Agatha Christie type of a murder mystery, because you really do need to know what's going on, even though you're not disclosing all the information to your reader. But for me, it really is more of a process of discovery and living with the character. Like, you got to start somewhere. And sometimes where I start a story is not really where the beginning in the final draft really is. Like sometimes the story really begins at another point. So I am more by the seat of my pants, like just kind of fly into it and see where you end up. Sometimes when I'm writing, I'll know where it needs to go from there up to a certain point. It's kind of like if you're driving in the fog, you can only see like 2 feet ahead, but then the fog clears and you can see like a block ahead, but you can't see any farther than that. That's kind of what the writing process is like. It's sort of like driving in the fog. So sometimes you can only see this far ahead, and other times you can see farther, and I'll make notes and say, okay, this is where I want it to go. And so when I pick up, I'll remember what I think the route is going to be going forward. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else got a question for me?
Well, I have an aside question.
Yeah.
Were you really reading books while Kelly and your brother were out playing baseball,
Yes.
climbing
Oh my
trees and
God.
rolling in the dirt?
Go ahead, answer it.
Yes.
My brother, Christine, and I are, I don't know, 8, 10.
We're 8 years apart.
And my brother's just 15 months older than me. And he used to always make fun of her because he's like, she's always got her face in a book. Even if she's sitting in front of the mirror, there's a book on her lap. Always.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's just who you are.
I just love books.
You
I
love
just
book-
love books. I
Stories
always
and
have.
words and
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
I mean, we did play Charlie's Angels with our neighbor down the street.
oh, that was so
But,
fun.
because it was, if anyone knows the Charlie's Angels, it's Sabrina, Kelly, and Chris. Kelly, Chris, and then poor Maria Gullo had to be Sabrina because we're like, I'm already Kelly, she's already Chris, so. How about the books that you have that are in some place in being written? Are they novels, and what type of novels are they, if they are? What are, tell us a little bit. Are you jumping away from this genre to something else?
So I have 2 novels that I am pretty far into, and they both take place in modern times. One of them takes place at a ranch up just beyond the Oregon border. It is a modern book, and it's about she's a ballet dancer who got badly injured and she couldn't do ballet anymore. And she goes to this ranch on a vacation and ends up really getting involved with the family who owns the ranch. It's a really good, uplifting story, and it's not supernatural. And then the other one is about a jazz singer she got perfect pitch. She's an excellent musician. She's trying to get her career off the ground, but she gets involved with a murder mystery. Like a murder happens, and he's a radio talk show host who interviews her, and she doesn't like him at first. And that takes place up in Seattle. So those 2, I'm super excited to finish them. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it'll happen soon. So
It's great.
yeah. I mean, I'm really eager to get, but my focus and concentration has been on this, and it will be for a little longer because I will bring this book out as an ebook, and I'd like to do an audiobook. I'm actually looking for a native British narrator who can because this takes place in Great Britain. So I need someone who can do a British accent, and a native narrator who's Brit would be my first choice. So I'm in the process, and I'm in those works. And if you all want to be on the list to have updates about this book and stuff that I'm doing, there's a little QR code over there that you can take a picture of and just do the QR code, give me your email through that QR code, and I'll keep you updated. You'll be on the update list.